I just want to briefly introduce Sarah and then turn things over without further ado. Sarah Iannarone is the Director of City Learning at First Stop Portland, which is a very cool best practices exchange house at Portland State University. Basically, she meets with officials and delegations from around the world that come to Portland to learn about innovative urbanism, and she's developed a place-based learning model to help cities and regions exchange ideas and practical wisdom more effectively and efficiently. Basically says there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So one of the things that she's going to do tonight then is share all that wisdom of all the places that people that she's met from around the world that have come to Portland to learn from her. She's a community leader and connector, active in urban planning and politics, organizing around issues of social justice and equity, placemaking, transportation, climate action, housing, and urban development. She also owns a very cool little cafe in Southeast Portland that if you're there you have to go to, the Arletta Library Cafe, which promotes fair labor practices and urban agriculture. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Halperin Landscape Conservancy, the City of Portland Bicycle Advisory Committee, Bureau of Transportation Budget Advisory Committee, and is the co-founder of Grassroots Ariata Triangle Project. Most recently, she has advised updates to the City of Portland Comprehensive Plan and the Portland Development Commission Strategic Plan. And I wanted to get all of that, so I had to apologize for reading, but her bio ends with, Sarah travels internationally to share ideas and engage in conversations around sustainable urban planning and development efforts. So that's exactly what she's doing for us tonight. And I'll just add one thing that isn't in the bio there. It is actually Sarah Iannarone's birthday tonight, so happy birthday. Without further ado, thank you, Sarah. Welcome.
Okay, logistics, now we're good. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. They say when anyone listens to a story that you tell, it's a gift. So what the best birthday present ever. I appreciate that, you coming out to hear what I have to say. And I'm actually grateful to Ruben and Cam and Jessica for hosting me tonight. And did I get your name wrong? Justine, my bad. Justine, for putting together this series tonight so I could come share my story with you. It's a little hard for me to be able to tell it in an hour because I have the story of First Stop Portland that I share with visitors from around the world. My job at Portland State University is actually to answer requests from civic leaders from across all sectors. So an elected official, a head of business, perhaps someone running a nonprofit organization that's heard maybe there's something special going on in Portland and they want to know what it is. They want to come kick the tires maybe on a light rail train. We have a really cool aerial tram they want to ride. They see that we've been doing compact urban development and they want to experience for themselves. And my job over the last decade has been to curate the learning experiences for these folks who I know are going to go home and make really important decisions in their place with regard to funding, with regard to planning, with regard to placemaking, and shape outcomes. So I've had to think carefully about the narrative that I share with these visitors from around the world and even what I show them. There's a great deal of responsibility that goes with that. And Cam actually brought one of the earliest delegations I had way back with your Cascadian Field School, and so I got to cut my chops in many ways among your students. So thank you for that learning experience. But in the subsequent years, I've learned a lot from doing this. I've had a lot of interesting conversations, and I've actually got to go and travel to talk further with these folks and find out what's really going on there. And so I thought that what I would come here and try to share with you tonight is not just the Portland story that I usually share with people who aren't from Portland, but a little bit about how I share that story and what I've learned along the way. So it's a 3-for-1. We'll see if we can fit it in. Before we get started, how many people here have been to Portland before? So a good number. So you're the fact checkers in the room. You're going to have to hold me accountable to make sure that I'm not deviating too far into the boosterism or too far into the navel gazing or too far in the hyper critique, because I think there's a balance there. But without further ado, we'll get started. And I would ask just for a little bit, because I'm trying to get through a lot, that we save questions to the end, unless there's a point of clarification. you didn't understand something, just pop in and let me know. Otherwise, we'll save some time at the end for solid discussion. So I get a lot of people coming to Portland and saying, yeah, we have heard there's something special here. We're going to hop on an airplane, use a lot of carbon, and come there to see what it's about. Some people come because they've seen the TV show Portlandia. It was kind of silly, right? We got a lot of play for that, more than we maybe would have liked. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into that bike culture. So we don't just ride bikes, we live them. You can live and die by them, and you can even finally go get drunk on them. We're known for our microbrews, right? We're known for not only the microbrew industry right now, but distilleries as well. So the artisan economy, we're pretty known for that. And also just the livability quotient, which if you're here in Victoria, you understand really well what it means to do placemaking and create a place that is perceived as livable, not just for the people who are living there, but for visitors from around the world. Because of that, we started to get a reputation, especially around 2012, 2013. It seemed like the New York Times was publishing something about, isn't Portland so great, every other month. We were a little bit overwhelmed, right? This story that was being told about us wasn't being told by us. And so these are some of the things that they were saying, right? Like, oh, it's a magnet for the creative class, it's a hipster enclave. Aren't they quirky? It's this DIY, they're renegade, they do things differently. And this mystique and almost celebrity started to emerge when you put all these things together. And that's what brings a lot of people to my city on the front end. But by the time they get there, I try to disabuse them of this notion before they've even walked through the door, if you will, by having a serious conversation with them about what are you really hoping to learn? Why are you going to put a coalition of people together, whether it's 5 or 20 or 100, travel to Portland to learn something with us? Why would you do that? Why would you undertake that action? Why would you make that investment and bear those costs? And what I find a lot is that people are looking for solutions to make their place better, and they think that they can learn something from us. So I try to go right to the heart of what problem it is they're trying to solve back at home, so we can start at the very beginning with regard to who are you and what are you trying to accomplish. When it comes to what's really special about Portland, the answer that I have for most people is nothing. Like, there wasn't really anything special about Portland when you looked at us back in the 1950s and 60s. One of the faculty at Portland State University likes to say that we didn't even talk about things like livability at that time. We were only talking about survivability, right? You have a place here that has a beautiful geography, and your geography is in many ways your destiny. But at the same time, there are many overlays of how we develop socially, how we do our planning, that shape the outcomes in our place. And what you were experiencing in Portland, if you were there in the 1950s and 60s, was a river that was a super fun cleanup site. We were getting poor air quality alerts from our federal government half the days of the year. There was intense racism, redlining, white flight, which resulted in suburbanization. Crime was high. We were demolishing business districts because what? People were getting in automobiles, driving to the suburbs to escape urban blight, shopping at supermalls. You know the story. And so what did you need to do to get people into and out of your city as fast as possible? You build freeways. Right? That's what freeways are for, to get a worker into the city and then back out to their home in the suburbs as fast as possible. There's nothing unique in that story. That's the urban story in North America in the mid-20th century. What I do think is special about Portland is there were a few people in our city, working in our downtown, working in the environmental movement, who said, hold the phone. This is not any way to move forward into the future. We need to chart a different course. And what they started to do was build processes so that we could actually think differently about our future. And the first one that we did was we decided to use urban planning to constrain sprawl. There was a visionary leader at the time, Mark Hatfield, who really understood the politics of our place, who understood that for us to get anything done in Oregon at the time was going to need to be bridging a huge political divide between urban elites, if you will, and more rural interests, which for us at the time were based in a timber. They were a resource extraction economy, so there was timber economy in Oregon. There was some steel, some manufacturing, but there was a huge divide. And what we had was a governor at the time, McCall, who said, let's actually think about a statewide law that says every single city or region in the state of Oregon has to do land use planning to constrain sprawl. And that is where we came up with the urban growth boundary concept, which is instrumental to the good Portland that you see today. A lot of people don't come to visit me to learn about an urban growth boundary unless they're a regional specialist looking in sprawl constraint mechanisms, but by darn, just about everybody who goes away from Portland goes home with the story of why we decided to come up with an urban growth boundary and implement that. So that statewide law, you can see in this picture is no joke, right? That bottom image. To the left, you're allowed to develop that land. To the right of that boundary, you're not. And there's a pretty clear line all around that. Now, as Portland continues to grow, continues to densify, we're starting to push up against this boundary. And so this is something that's coming into our conversation again and again. This line that we've drawn around our place doesn't really leave our imagination. What we did to manage that growth boundary was we created the first directly elected regional government in the United States of America. To this day, it remains the only one. There are a couple other regional governments that are appointed, but ours is the only directly elected regional government in the United States. This is very important because this regional government actually is the one who manages our smart growth policy and helps us bring together 24 cities in 3 counties to coordinate the central efforts like land use and transportation planning that shape outcomes for people all across that urban growth boundary. So you don't have a city on one side of the region competing for resources with a city on the other side of the region. You have an integrated plan that looks like this, which guides our growth. It is something that we come to the table to talk about. It is something that we have built. There are places in there, those dark brown areas are reserves where if we should need to expand that boundary, and that's an if, then that is where we have already decided we will expand it. This pulls it out of the political process, right? It depoliticizes it, and we've had to set up outside measures to determine which land will be pulled in to the supply at what time. And this goes right down to soil quality and what is best for agriculture versus what is best for development, among other things. This is a very intentional approach to managing growth, and this is our regional plan. The city where I live, Portland, is the biggest dot right in the center there. It's the largest city by far in the region, and it's the economic driver of the region and in large part the state. But ultimately, we all have to work together to realize our shared goals for the future. Another part of the story that I tell them is that we really thought carefully about what a city should look like. In our 1972 downtown plan, I am convinced, no one has proven me wrong yet, so I haven't eliminated all possibility, but I think it is the first mention of peak oil in any urban plan that I've seen. Our 1972 downtown plan talks about what would happen when we get to the end of our fossil fuel reality and how we need to think differently about a future. So that was as far away as 1972. By the time we did our 1988 downtown plan, we were thinking about what does it mean to no longer have automobiles in our city. And I'm going to talk about where the rubber hits the road literally on this because we haven't realized this to the extent that I would like, but the thinking was there. And you had people on a page talking about what does it mean to retrofit our city away from the automobile so that it's better for people. Some concrete examples of what we did was we actually removed the Harbor Freeway and built a waterfront park, and we stopped the urban freeway plan, this one was done also in 1972, that's what our city would have looked like, crisscrossed by freeways. And instead, we sent our leaders to DC to negotiate, and we brought that money back to the Portland region and made the first light rail transit investments. And this was at the beginning when most cities and regions were still investing aggressively in highway expansion. So that deliberate shift away from the automobile is something special that we chose to do. And what we did instead was we worked on creating transportation options. So one reason people from around the world think it's a good investment to come visit me is because we're a little mini transportation lab. You can come to Portland and ride just about any form of transit you can imagine at this point. We don't have a monorail yet. We don't have elevated train or subway, but short of that, we have light rail and streetcar and an aerial tram and bus system and bike share and scooter share and car share and all sorts of things, in addition to a pretty healthy bike network and a really great quality of the urban realm for pedestrian experience. We thought carefully about what it means for our city center to be vibrant. How many of you were here for Mark Lakeman's talk last month? So Mark might have talked to you about Pioneer Courthouse Square, which is up in the top left there. His parents were instrumental in taking this parking garage, which is on the right, which was at the time 3 stories, right in the center of our downtown. There was a plan in place to expand that to an 8-story parking garage. And a bunch of folks just said enough is enough. If we're going to transform cities away from automobiles, then the last thing we really need is a place for automobiles to sleep motionless all day. What if we activated that space so that the public could occupy it? And it really was informed by the ideas of the Agora that he talked about there, which a healthy civic realm would be both activated and maintained by having a healthy commons. And so all across Portland you will see at this time we are making investments in parks, green spaces, public plazas, and other what I would call the civic realm in Portland. We have very healthy investments in this period. We also undertook the first urban streetcar project in the contemporary post-automobile era. So many of the, as you know, US cities had streetcars in the early part of the 20th century. Most of them pulled them out. If you were New Orleans and lucky enough to be that slow at things, you got to keep yours, but otherwise most places lost their streetcars. And so we had all these amazing streetcar neighborhoods with no streetcars, so we decided to put the streetcars back through as an urban revitalization and urban development tool. At the same time, we had to think about the city as a whole. And so what we did was we thought at the neighborhood scale. So we revitalized the town center as a regional amenity, but then we understood that the place where people live out their lives is the block where they reside. And what we really needed to do was make sure that people had everything that they needed in the course of their day within a quick walk, bike ride, or transit ride from where they lived. And so we started to think about the concept of the 20-minute neighborhood. The planners are no longer using that term. Sometimes it disappoints me because I think it's pretty quaint, it's pretty tidy, but we're calling them complete neighborhood now. But we're thinking about, in many ways, and trying to measure, what does it mean to really check and see if every Portlander has access to a complete neighborhood? So this is a tool out of our planning bureau. It's really a heat map. There are a lot of different factors that go into this analysis, but they have everything to do from the terrain, whether you've got a steep grade, whether you've got sidewalks, whether you've got things you can walk to. And the places that are really hot on there, I mean, those are pretty close to being a complete neighborhood, where if you lived there and didn't own an automobile, you wouldn't notice in your quality of life unless you had a long commute to maybe work or your job. The places that are in purple or green are forests. We have a lot of urban forests as well. But the places that are in purple are places that have much more either suburban feel because of the urban design or because of the era at which they were incorporated to the city, and so they don't share that tight, beautiful grid like you have in your downtown, where you have a great urban form that's built around a much smaller scale than the automobile. To make all this possible, Portland is a place that's not very affluent. So we didn't have any big benefactors we could go to. The state of Oregon didn't have a lot of money for us to make these investments. And so we had to come up with creative partnerships along the way to make most of the projects that we've undertaken happen. Our first light rail alignment was paid for with 85% federal dollars. Our last one, where you see this bridge being built right here, we only had 50% federal money, so that's almost half of that was, a few dollars came from the state, but almost half of that $1.65 billion was local. And the way that we pull that together is by making sure that all the stakeholders are at the table, but also thinking about how can we leverage our very limited infrastructure dollars to meet some of our shared goals with regard to economic development, with regard to equity, with regard to accessibility. So that bridge that we ended up building is the first new car-free bridge in the modern era. It's a transit, pedestrian and bike bridge that connects our central east side, where there's like a lot of maker spaces and creative economy activities, with the west side, where we have high intensity R&D in the biotech, biosciences. The Knight Cancer Research with $1 billion from Phil Knight is there. So we actually leveraged the transit investments to connect cultures and not just locations in our city. What we've done by hammering these out and putting these on paper is we've built trusting relationships across sectors over time in many of these endeavors. So in that bridge, you've got everything from university to children's museum to real estate developers to hospitals, 3 higher ed, you've got a community college in there, a whole business sector on the east side, and downtown neighbors in that conversation. So there's a high level of collaborative governance going on. There's a lot of convening of multi-stakeholder processes, right down to the naming of the bridge, which ultimately was Bridge of the People, the Tillicum Crossing. And even that was done by committee. So there was a contest. Anyone could, in the city of Portland, could submit a name that they wanted that. I think the Lisa Simpson Bridge was a pretty strong contender for a very long time from The Simpsons. But ultimately that list went to then a committee that was comprised of people from marginalized communities, historians, other key stakeholders who narrowed it down and selected Bridge of the People. So a lot of civic effort goes into making these things successful on our side. And making sure that people are engaged in these processes is very important. So at the same time as we told the federal government, no, we don't want your money for freeway expansion, but yes, we'll take it and invest it in freeway or in light rail and transit, we set up a neighborhood association system where there were almost de facto mini city halls all around our city where neighbors could go to deliberate public safety issues, land use issues, and there are 96 of those around the city of Portland now where neighbors can go and have a conversation about what they think should be happening in the future of their place. One of the things that we're having to face now is that we've actually done such a good job of building social cohesion among these neighborhood associations that there's a NIMBYism. You guys are talking about NIMBYism, I guess? Anybody raise your hand if you've got NIMBYism going on? It's pretty much everywhere. When you've got such high social cohesion and people are so closely tied and they've been working on these political processes for 30, 40 years, some of them, they know the ins and outs of government and can get things done. So we're having to think about new ways of engaging the public, and I'll talk about that in a minute. At the same time, in meeting some of our environmental goals, Portland was the first city to have a climate action plan. We worked on that with the county, Multnomah County, and we tried to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Kyoto Protocol. So we set a target for that long before any other US city was thinking about that. And in doing so, that actually resulted in us cultivating a pretty strong green building sector there, where we had a large body of expertise, technical expertise, but also social expertise, not only of how we would design things green, but how we would implement them more sustainably. And so ultimately, Portland worked about 15 years ago thinking about what did it mean for us to invest in things like, at the time it was called POSI, so it was a Portland Institute for Sustainability. The seed of things like First Stop Portland was born. We brought in the Brookings Institute to start thinking about how can we leverage some of these activities that we're engaged in about the future of our place that we want to see here so we can be more competitive in the global marketplace. We came up with an export strategy for our green expertise, similar to our streetcar. When we made investments in streetcar, we tried to invest in streetcar manufacturing there. Same with bicycling. When we invested in the bicycle network, it helped us grow a whole economy around bicycle manufacturing and accessories. So always thinking about, is there an economic benefit for the people who are here in some of these things? So with this kind of thinking, we went from a city that was largely down and out to what I'm called upon now to talk about as a model city, right? And so you hear we're on this circuit, this fast policy circuit for policymakers thinking about where can I go for an idea about how to make my city better. If I want to study transit, where do I go? Pop up some names that aren't Portland. Where would you go? Don't be shy.
Amsterdam.
Yeah, Amsterdam. Biking, where do you go? Copenhagen. Where do you want to go if you want to study subways?
London.
Yeah, see, you all have ideas. These are these cities that you're known as being good at something. And Portland suddenly was catapulted into this category for its sustainable urban development chops, right? And so now suddenly we're on the world stage. We've done these things over a 40-year period to make a place that was good for us, and the rest of the world wants to know how we're doing it. At the same time, we were starting to experience a wave of population influx of young creatives. So that idea that we were attractive creatives, something we were doing was attractive to them, that level of urban living, those urban amenities were attractive. And so Portland started to take on this mystique of, this is the place I really want to be. But what we found was, at the same time as Portland was growing and changing, other parts of Portland and Oregon's history were increasingly evident. The fact that we were making these investments in sustainability and making these investments in livability, but they weren't accruing to everyone in our society, let alone accruing equally to everyone in our society, meant that we had to take a careful look at what we were doing altogether. There was a lot of talk. An important academic, Walida Immarisha, who's now at UC Berkeley, started writing about Oregon's white supremacist utopian origins and how our state was set up as a place that was supposed to be an outpost for white people and white supremacy. It was a beautiful dream there, and what they created worked really well for people who fit a particular definition of what an Oregonian should be. But what that meant was what we had created wasn't working well across the board, and we needed to do something about it. So we kept talking. That's one thing, when you build a culture of deliberation, when you build a culture of collaboration, when you build a culture of innovation, you can start thinking differently about how you're going to do things and learn as you go and be intentional about that. So we started thinking, well, let's start documenting what it is we're doing here. We are creating transparent, accessible governance and collaboration models, right? We are achieving some of our goals with regard to climate action. We are moving people around the city and region efficiently, and we are improving livability while we grow the economy. But let's make sure that it accrues to everyone equally. And so we are coming up with new tools so that we're going beyond neighborhood associations now to different places in our city to make sure that everyone is included in these processes. We're making sure that newcomers are welcome in our city. And this is not just migrants from around the United States, but immigrants from around the world who may be coming to Portland voluntarily or involuntarily residing there. What does it mean for them to have a place in our city, not just being assimilated, but leading from a place of comfort and culture that works for them? Does it mean that we can think about diverse ways of engaging people so that their input is not just required, but meaningful and effective? And we've had to think carefully about this. I actually threw it out to some folks on social media the other day about, what do you really think is going on here? What do you think we've learned from struggling through some of these challenges and making sure that our livability dividend has a fair payout across our society? And one young organizer, Jiraj, he works with APANO, which is an association of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Oregon, talked about the fact that we're actually having communities of color and other marginalized groups lead the way in Portland. And it's starting to work. We just passed the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which I think is a really amazing initiative where it's a business tax that then goes in to low-income communities to help us with the just transition away from fossil fuels. We finally elected our first African-American city commissioner this last election cycle, and we're starting to do things like apply equity indexes to our transportation investments to make sure that we're not just basing our decisions about how our resources are allocated based on people's political power in City Hall, but perhaps vulnerability indexes, socioeconomic status, and even risk associated with not being an English as a first language speaker. So all of these measures that we're putting in place are helping us ensure that we're doing a better job than we were doing before. And by virtue of that, the work that I do, I think, even takes on a more important valence now. Because the people who come to visit me from around the world aren't asking to see my Housing Bureau Vulnerability Index. They're not saying, hey Sarah, how did you get that equity agenda at the top of your policy discussions? That's not what brings people to Portland. What brings them to Portland is still sustainability, right? Or public-private partnerships, how did you pay for that? But fortunately, because I'm the leader of these programs, I get to say, well, wait, we need to talk about a few things, because if you're going to make these decisions in your place, you probably should learn from what we've learned along the way, which is making sure that you're thinking about the things that maybe we didn't think about 40 years ago when we undertook this green agenda, but you can do better now. In doing so, there's a lot of networking that goes on when people come. I don't claim to be the expert on things. I connect the people who come with the people who are doing the same work that they're doing, so that they build a relationship across their places. I talk about different things in terms of what are you building and why, and how can we think differently about what's going on there. And then we're also thinking carefully about what does this mean for us to continue to cultivate these relationships over time. So my program, First Stop Portland, has institutionalized the practice of welcoming people to the city for city learning. This definition is from our early website. When we first opened in 2009, we thought we were going to be welcoming guests almost as if it was a walking tour, right? You come to Portland and we'll show you around, but what we found is that the curation of what we think you should be seeing in our place and what we think you should be hearing about our place is almost as important as what people are saying they think they should be coming to our place to learn about. By connecting people to their peers, it helps have an authentic conversation about what's working and what's not. These are honest conversations because I'm housed at the university, not the Chamber of Commerce. I'm not a bureaucrat whose funding is contingent on whether or not my project is seen in a good light. The folks who are working on these projects can have an honest discussion about what worked and what didn't. What would you do differently? If you had different resources, would you have done something better? If you had control of this project, would you do it again? What have you learned? That's the kind of conversation in the policy realm that you don't get to be a part of oftentimes. People are focused on coming up with an idea, implementing it, evaluating success, maybe measuring ROI, and then moving on to the next thing. But really, when you think of the pedagogy of what we're doing here is encouraging policymakers to think of this as a learning process is pretty transformative in terms of how cities make policy. Because of that, here are just some stats. I've hosted over 5,000 visitors. We've had over 300 delegations. We've hosted 40 conferences. It's taken me almost 700 days to get that amount of information across, and 85% of my visitors are from outside the US. So it means we have a huge reach when it comes to the conversations we're having. The conversations that you have here in your community are important and they're fundamental, but also the conversations you have about what's happening in your community with the rest of the world, I think especially in this highly connected world in which we live, they're increasingly important. Bruce Campbell wrote a book, Beyond Smart Cities, in which he starts to measure some of this. He looked at the impacts of cities learning, whether or not they're taking trips, where they're going, what they're thinking about. And it's where I learned the lesson from him of we really should not be reinventing the wheel when it comes to some of these policy innovations that we're working on. We know that compact, walkable downtowns have a revitalizing impact. We recognize that making investments in affordable housing adjacent to transit are the way that we need to be developing so people have access not only to housing, but to opportunity and mobility. But by housing this in the university, we actually accomplished a few things, and that was really innovative too, because we overlook our universities as places that can be real connectors for some of the things that we're trying to accomplish. So by housing me in the university, my university status got to be elevated. We then in turn get to elevate the city of Portland and region's status. I'm perceived as a neutral broker. I don't have a horse in this race, right? I didn't vote on it, I didn't fund it. You can trust what I'm saying to you. You have access to the best information, not just in our community, but inside our university. So you can talk to practitioners, you can talk to researchers, you can trust that the information that you're getting about our place will be reliable when you go home. And it also helps create a new vibe for those of you who are interested. I don't know how many of you, how many here are in the university sector? I mean, the new reality for funding universities, at least in the States, it's complicated. And so having programs like this that bring many parties together in conversation about the future actually helps you expand your reach into your community and think of new ways to bring funding into your organization. But you know, there are some scholars who wonder, is this just policy tourism, right? Does this matter? Maybe these folks are just coming, taking a picture of your streetcar, going home, selling it to their public, and that's that. Is that really a good thing? Am I just a neoliberal shill so you can transform as much urban space to extract profit as possible? I mean, it happens. I have Japanese rail companies that come to Portland and they want to know, hey, how can I do some placemaking around this station I'm about to invest in? So I can maximize, you know, the outcomes of my project, which if you're a private sector person means maximizing profit. But while I have those folks in my classroom, while I have those folks in that room, I keep it real with them. And I talk to them about this equity question. I talk to them about this conversation that we're having in Portland. And in many ways, when you start to interact even on this human level with these people who are so influential and making these decisions almost as if they're operating in a vacuum from the people that their projects are intended to serve, it creates a cognitive shift. It creates an awareness of, why are they even talking about equity in Portland? Why would they even start thinking about that? So in many ways, the learning process for some folks, we start at the very beginning, it's elementary, but it's still important and influential. Because we're hosted by the EU, and thank you for your support of this lecture, I did want to highlight a few things about actually our connection. We've had 39 countries, but these are the EU countries we've hosted, and I thought it would be kind of fun, especially since I wasn't able to pull out all 39 countries, exactly what kind of folks are coming through First Stop Portland, just the range, but also the level. So some of my favorites, the Spanish Trade Commissioner was a very down-to-earth guy and wanted to know, you know, about the differences between agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, and even the urban knowledge economy. Germany, they sent hundreds of academics over to look at all kinds of things. It's interesting, from Great Britain, Grosvenor Development Corp is the oldest real estate development corporation noted on the planet, as far as I'm aware, in terms of, I'm a real estate development corporation, hundreds of years old, and they manage all of the real estate for the crown, I guess. So what they take away, I'm not privy to, but it was an interesting interaction for sure. So those are the kinds of folks that I host. And I wanted to give you a couple of case studies because I think it's really interesting what people end up taking away. So this is the Vice Mayor for Environment from Stockholm, Pers Ankersno, and he and a delegation came through Portland, and I'm not going to read to you what they said, I'll just summarize it for you. But their takeaway when they left was basically like, we don't want to see your active transportation infrastructure, we don't want to see your transit infrastructure, we want to see your community. Because as you look at what he's talking about in here, is that we do our city based on function, right? We're a medieval city, we have a form, everything we do is based on that form, and we have to accommodate. But what you do here is based on aspiration. It's about bringing people together to realize a shared vision for your future. And his advice when he was leaving was, I need to do more of what you're doing, and you need to do more of what I'm doing back at home. But this is the kind of exchange, the learning exchange that goes on when you get to have someone who's making decisions about environmental policy in their city, looking about how we're thinking about environmental policy in our city. Another model city that came through was Copenhagen. Copenhagen and Amsterdam both visited with us a bunch, but I thought this one was particularly interesting to share with you because University of Copenhagen is thinking about building an innovation district. Is anyone familiar with the innovation district concept? Couple. It's a little bit trendy in the urban policy realm. So it's this notion that we make certain investments and that will spur innovation in an area, and then that contributes to the local and regional economy and then has the ripple effects. Portland has had one underway for almost a decade now. We call it the Innovation Quadrant, and it's part of that bridge that we built across the river. The car-free bridge is a component of that. But what it is connecting various research and education centers, not only by transportation infrastructure, but also conceptually in terms of education pathways and their linkages to neighborhoods around the city. So when the University of Copenhagen came to town, they actually met with the people who were building our innovation quadrant and got right down to the nuts and bolts. How did you make this happen? How does it work? Is it penciling? Are you able to make it work out? But again, those values in terms of equity, access, transparency were always on the table because they're woven throughout what we're doing in our city right now. And so when the folks from Copenhagen went away, even though they're perceived as maybe above Portland in the sustainable urban development experiment or efforts or initiatives, there was a lot of learning that was able to happen between the two cities because of the different frameworks and sets of priorities that we're bringing to the conversation. Another cool case I just thought I would tell you about because I got back from Korea recently and I had the good fortune of watching a city get built. The Sejong, Korea, I had a scout actually who was working for the head of an administration that had been tasked by the central government to go forth and build Asia's newest green city. Seoul is like a 25 million person mega region and they're running out of space, so they need to think about how to get people out of Seoul. So as the government, they thought, well, we control all the government workers, so we'll build a government city for 500,000 people about 30 kilometers southwest of Seoul, and we'll relocate them there. And so his task in about 5 years was to build a city for 500,000 people. He sent a scout first to Portland to check it out, and then the chairman of this project came over next. And when he got there, he said, we've already started building a bunch of this, and what we're finding is that the cars are going way too fast to our city. Well, when they started from scratch, they built the city for 500,000 people from day one, and there were only about 35,000 people in the city at that point. So of course they were going really fast because there was no one there, and they could just speed around like it was a racetrack. So it was a conversation with one of our transportation planners who said, well, why don't you just adjust the signal timing until you have more people in your city and see if that works out. And fortunately, I got to go over to Sejong last month and meet with them. They're up to about 300,000 people now. I know, just like that math, right? It makes your brain hurt when you think about the importance of these conversations. But a lot of the principles that they had come to Portland to talk about, I could see being implemented there in Sejong. And so when we talk about whether or not this is policy tourism or actually transformative interaction, I think it is. Because even if they don't necessarily do everything in ways that may match up with the way Portland would do it, at least they're thinking about some of the things that they might not have been thinking about before, which for us was the human scale. What does it mean to build a place that not only makes it efficient for people to move around the city, but to connect with each other in the city? Things like that. And I am running low on time, so I want to push a little bit through. This is one of my favorite case studies ever, was from Laikipia, Kenya. When the government devolved, they decided that they needed to set up whole new governments. And so this wise person, who's now a parliament member, at the time was on the local commission, said, we're taking a study trip to Portland because we've heard they understand civic engagement. And he and his delegation spent a week with me, and we exchanged a lot of lessons and ideas, and then he went home, brought a lot of them into his community engagement processes there, where the parliament members and the leaders from their place were going out and actively engaging people from all around the rural communities in his county. to really come up with some innovative things that they'd never had there before, to engage not just the development class and the settler class, because there were Europeans who'd settled there on reserves, but to engage the people of his place in shaping a future for their place. And they met with the people who built our urban growth boundary, who built our regional government, so that they could even share conversations about how you built a government from scratch. And like I said, he was just elected to the Kenyan parliament, so I think he's doing things right, or at least people think he's doing things right. He's a magnificent person. So, you know, these are the questions that I ask every day. What are we doing here? Like, what is happening? What are we sharing, what's not? What's changing over time? And one of the things that I've had to make sure that I impart to people is that context matters. It's not what Portland is doing that you should take away. It's that what Portland is doing is trying to do what works for people in Portland, right? We're trying to build a good place for the people that are here. How do you know what that is? You know what that is by talking to them, by going to them, by convening them, by having accessible and transparent processes, by setting visions together, by articulating your values together. And you have to do what works for you, right? Don't take home and do what works for Portland, but take those principles of engagement, take those principles of a long-term vision, take those principles of connection between people and place, and see how those play out in your society. It's a leap of faith for many of these policymakers who've been sent by their boss. That chairman was sent by the president of Korea to go build a green city, and you need to come home with tools to come home and understand that investment in community may have been as important as investment in BRT. And actually, when I was there, not many people were riding the BRT yet, but there was a bit of community going on. So I don't know. I can't measure it, but I'd like to say it matters. Another thing that we've learned, and this slide has a lot of text, I'm not going to read it for you, but it really is this notion that governance is not about ruling over people. It's not about telling the public what you're going to do. It's about having a conversation with the people in your place about the future of your place. And governance isn't using the conversation to have an outcome. Governance is the conversation, right? The way that we shape sustainable outcomes in our place is by having meaningful, inclusive conversations about that, so that the best ideas from the range of voices can be included in our decision making, and we know that we're accomplishing good things to the best that we're able. I use an illustration from a group of Shanghai planners, about 25 planners from Shanghai who were sent over. And if you know anything about Chinese development, it's happening at a rate that would blow your mind. Sometimes they'll send me over 20 or 30 mayors at a time, and they'll say, well, they're just from small cities, you know, 5, 10 million people each. But I would say to them, well, you don't really have to do civic engagement. You have centralized command of planning processes. You can do whatever you want. Why would you come see me? Well, we've heard that your outcomes are pretty good here, so you must be doing something right. You're planning. Well, you're a planner. You have the same planning tools that we have. Well, what we have is an engagement process that's necessary, not optional, and that by virtue of engaging a diversity of stakeholders, by virtue of convening people around the table of necessity, that is why our outcomes are good. So even if you don't understand it on the face of it, oh, I value democracy, oh, I value equity, oh, I value inclusion, you can look from a purely outcomes perspective to say, this is helping us achieve good things because we have the best information from the people who are closest to the problems that they're trying to solve. And also it helps us, we don't have a lot of litigation around our projects. We don't have a lot of challenges down the road because we tend to hammer them out on the front end. And just like the naming of that bridge, everybody and their mother was involved. So when the name of the bridge finally came out, there weren't too many people who were like, oh man, I really wanted the Lisa Simpson Bridge. Like they understood how we arrived at that together. This one I'll move through quick, but I do think it's important. Planning as a culture matters. You need to invest in planning as part of your culture. It's the civic infrastructure of your place. If you look at the things that Portland is doing right, it's because we are planning them. We are not thinking about the next quarterly return. We're not even really thinking about the next political cycle. We're actually trying to build institutions like that UGB that are durable beyond the ebbs and flows of politics, that are durable beyond the ebbs and flows of the economy, so that they can sustain us. Some of that thinking, I think, is lost because it seems like planning is a profession. It's a technical undertaking, but really when you think about it, to have effective planning processes, you need to have everybody at the table. You need to be engaging people in meaningful ways so that it's ongoing and people have a high level of understanding of what they're trying to accomplish in their place. A few of the things that I see changing in the 10 years that I've been doing this are pretty significant, especially for those of you who are studying cities. I think second-tier cities are going to increase in prominence. There's a scale to that. When I think about my trip to Seoul last month and what they have to do when they need to turn that ship, it's gigantic, right? But when you think about cities like Portland or even Vancouver, right, you can think about, wow, if we changed a little bit here, it could have a pretty dramatic outcome in shaping how we do things as a practice here. And I see that awareness happening. You see in cities like Louisville, Nashville. These second-tier cities are saying, yeah, I think we can actually, Denver, right? We can really turn the ship here a little bit. I also see equity and inclusion coming onto urban agendas. I don't know how much you're talking about it here. I think you're talking about it quite a bit. In some cases, maybe not so much in others. But I think as cities are moving forward, making sure that equity and inclusion are on the policy agenda is something we're going to see more of, not less of. I've seen more requests for understanding why we need to have meaningful engagement, not less. In keeping with that observation is a shift from people wanting that hard infrastructure technology, Sarah, teach me how to build a bioswale, teach me how to build a green roof, to how do you decide as a community what the percentage of green roofs you should have in a community will be? What does it look like to convene that process? How will you set up the structures to pay for it? Do you need to come up with nonprofits to bridge the divide across sectors? There's a lot deeper digging into the hows of good outcomes and less on the surface, what I would call technical transfer. I think a lot of the ideas around green building, around sustainability have moved. People have been educated over the last 20, 30, 40 years in the triple bottom line. They've gone to graduate school, they've gone to professional conferences. The ideas are out there. What people really want to know is, how do I make it happen? How do I implement this? How can we realize this together? We know what we need to do, but we don't know how to do it. And so I talk about that a lot in terms of building the civic infrastructure. What does it mean for you to make investments in civic infrastructure? The term sustainability, I'm not hearing it as much anymore. I still think it's important. I think it's a valuable framework for thinking about this, but it's just not as trendy in the policy discourse. I do hear a lot of things in terms that I think are more inclusive. Age-friendly cities is a really inclusive term. Disaster-ready cities, resiliency. You hear a lot of talk about resiliency, and all of these things, to me, reflect that addition of a more civic infrastructure component to that, being beyond a purely technical transfer. And I do think that the creative or knowledge economy and the economies of our cities and how we shape our urban environments around them is going to be of increasing importance. It's not that manufacturing and more traditional urban land uses are not valuable, it's just our economy is reorganizing, and so we need to think about things like the maker spaces and how we continue to have those valuable activities in our city, but in light of the creative economy and the knowledge economy, not despite it. The implications for those of you who would like to do storytelling here about your place, or maybe even think about starting programs like this at your university, or as you go forth into your careers or into your communities. Authentic storytelling can be transformative. I've never seen people trying to exchange ideas connect, like when they talk about how they've failed at something. I've had people who were talking about the story of forming our regional government say, this was like a 5-beer problem. We sat for hours, it took us 5 beers before we could figure this out. And then you see the policymakers on the other side of the table laugh because they understand that frustration. And so now there's a connection, and that this story, we share in this story now. And it really has an impact as far as people being able to maintain these conversations over time. And so that's a really important thing that I don't think you get maybe networking at a professional conference, where it's okay to tell the truth about what's going on. You don't have to be self-congratulatory. You don't have to be successful at everything you do. And one of the things I work hard to do is build a bunch of competing narratives into a single story. So I can tell a story of a district that in a textbook is perceived as this, look at this award-winning transit-oriented development that Portland has done. And I can find you 5 people who tell you why it's horrible, why it's been a bad idea, why maybe we should have done it differently. And I don't try to necessarily evaluate those as this is the better narrative. I look for high-quality, authentic narratives from people all over my city who have something to add to the conversation. So the people that come to visit me go away with a complexity of what's happening in Portland. And they have to then weigh these competing narratives against each other to find what is the common thread that every single person there, even if they disagreed on the surface wholeheartedly, what was that one thing that they were saying that mattered? And it deepens the learning experience, but it also makes that more reliable information, because it's not boosterism. Oh, isn't Portland so great? I'll have someone tell you how great our infrastructure is. At the same time, I will take you a mile outside of the city center and show you places where we don't have sidewalks or infrastructure at all. And so that understanding of how these things are interrelated is very important to get across to the people who are making big decisions about our urban futures. Practice what you preach is important. I move our delegations around our city by transit. That can be very hard when they are big. I move our delegations around our city by bicycle. I move them around on foot. I've grabbed, the mayor, Lord Clovermore, the mayor of Sydney, who was trying to unilaterally push through a bicycle network, and getting huge resistance came. She had a broken foot at the time, so we put her in a pedicab, but just really dragged her around the city and talked to the neighbors and talked to the people who were there, had a brown bag at the university, really got down into the nitty-gritty of, if we're going to learn about bicycles, we're going to do it on bicycles. If we're going to learn about conversations about bicycles, we're going to bring all the bicycle advocates into the room, and we do the story while we're telling the story, so we live it. It's not one story that I give to the world and a different story that my visitors see with me. And then I do think that using that university as a neutral broker is something that you can do in your city. If you're having a problem, if there's some challenge that you're facing, putting it in a neutral place where there's not someone with a vested interest in that outcome can be very helpful for navigating the complexity. They bring the academic weight, but also that neutrality serves as a safe space for people to engage in learning without feeling challenged that they have to perform in a certain way. So that's a lot of different valences of what I'm trying to work on in a single talk, but I wanted to give it to you there because it seemed to me like the City Talks model was really about digging in a little bit deeper than just the Portland story per se, which we could talk about, forever. But really it's that thinking about how you're going to talk about your place and how you're going to talk about it together to shape outcomes in your place that's fundamental to how you're going to engage with people who want to come talk to you about your place. And with that, I think I'll open it up to questions and answers. I'm guessing we'll have a lot because there was a lot of material to cover there. So thank you very much. Or maybe none. Maybe we can just go up here now. Yeah, sure. Just will you stand up and speak loud so everyone can hear you?
Yeah. So you were telling us a little bit about how there's the, in Portland there was the municipal government, but then there was the regional government that was elected. I just had a question. Was there a lot of political will to get that formed, or what was the process in getting that regional level governance made with all the power that it has?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and one that I try to unpack the best I'm able, which is the secret to forming that regional government seems simple on the face, but it really was, what is the shared interest about people who seem like they have competing interests on the surface? So what we had was an understanding that we needed to constrain that urban environment. For the rural communities, that was because that would be encroaching on their livelihoods. For the urbanists, it meant that if we constrained the urban environment, we could have that compact urban form that they knew in theory was the design of a place that they wanted. So once we were able to find the bridge, we then took a very, what I would call almost journalistic approach to documenting how we would think about the negotiation, not just as a, oh, let's keep our eyes on the prize, we have to create this regional government, but more like, let's start building structures to realize our goals. That deliberative process, I think, is the secret. If you ask a lot of people in Portland today, they say they don't think that we would be able to probably do that in the contemporary era. It's too contentious, it's too polarizing. You can't really have conversations about bridging divides. It's really heated. I like to disagree because I actually think that if you work really hard to find the common ground and then build forward from that, that's the rationale for coming together. You just have to look really carefully for what that shared interest is. So that was at the basis of it. And we also let it evolve. So it's that willingness to start. We started with something that was called CRAG, which is an agglomeration of the regional governments. And then in order to give it that toothiness, that policy toothiness of being able to legislate that boundary, because think about how political that is with regard to the property values inside and outside. That toothiness, when you started to see that, you knew that that had to be a government, because otherwise how do you do legislation around that, right? And so I think it's not saying that we're going to create this thing to affect this, but more like we need to affect this. What thing do we need to create it? And that's a very, very short answer for things that people have written whole books about. But is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You said 85% of your visitors are international, and I wondered why there aren't more from places in the United States where Portland is the envy, but it seems like a lot of those cities or smaller cities have almost lost the ability to become like Portland. Why are there why aren't there more?
Yeah, so the question for those of you in that side was, you said 85% of the delegations were international. Why not more American cities? I've asked myself this, and I've also never had a delegation from India, right? And so when I think about when I try to think about why people might not be coming, I can't even look at the India question because I don't know how I would answer it. But for the US cities, I think it comes down to a couple things. I don't really know that too many US cities until maybe the last decade or so were really invested in the sustainable retrofit. They're looking at things in terms of economic development, and those policies and conversations are really easy to find. People who come to Portland have heard that they either want to double down on attracting the creative class. They have a certain sense of what they're trying to achieve, and they come to Portland because they think we're really good at it. And I don't know that the rest of the United States actually wants to be like Portland. We're kind of a little European city nestled in the Pacific Northwest of the United States of America. So, yeah, I don't know how many American cities even aspire to be like us. They think we're a little wacky and iconoclastic, and why would we want to ride our bikes around naked, you know? So, that may be part of it. I also don't know that when you look at the current federal government, not just this one, but for the last few decades, we haven't had a federal urban policy. So Portland has been very creative in coming up with financing to realize its goals, But other places don't have money for those urban investments either, and they don't have those collaborative governance structures and those partnerships to achieve them. So when you look at cities like Pittsburgh, that was largely, their revitalization was based largely in philanthropic sector. And so Portland has a very horizontal model that maybe other cities don't even have that culture or that economic reality to realize. I'm gonna go here and then there.
Do you find when those groups come to you and they have those like preconceived agendas of what they want to accomplish, do you find that they leave with those kind of like fulfilled, or do they like keep trying to like throw them on their head? So
Well, I have to be almost like that matchmaker in the neighborhood, right? Like, what do you say you want versus what do you really want? And part of that is about the questions I ask again about what problem are you trying to solve. Like if someone has said our community has come together and we decided we want to make a light rail investment and we want to look as closely at your light rail as we can, by all means, that's exactly what I do, and I try to do it to the best of my ability in a really professional way. If they come to me and say, oh, we've heard, you know, that if we make this certain kind of investment, it will attract the creative class, I try to disabuse them of that notion, because one, I don't know how many creative class people you actually want. What you want is people who are interested in your place and find it desirable, who you think are interesting and desirable, and you want them to want to stay there. Right? For a lot of my Japanese delegations, they say, how can I be attracted to the creative class? But really what they're saying is, how can we not lose all our young people to Osaka and Tokyo, right? And so what I try to talk to them about is what makes Portland attractive, not just to the creative class that you may be trying to attracting, but to across the generations that in the long term, that's gonna sustain you. So I do have to parse it out a little bit, but I think it's about asking people what problem are they trying to solve, not what answer do they want on the surface.
Thank you, Sarah, for your talk. Can you just reiterate how many neighborhood associations you said you had in Portland?
Yeah, it's 96 neighborhood associations, and they are operating under 7 coalition offices.
Okay. I'm just curious to know from like an equity and inclusion lens, like we have 13 neighborhood associations here with different interests, and they have varying political powers, and you know, housing affordability is one of the bigger issues that come across, I think, many cities. I'm just curious to know how you end up kind of facilitating or collaborating with so many different neighborhood associations, and we're only dealing with 13 here and we're having challenges, but I'm just curious to know, I guess, your input of maybe some lessons learned or maybe stories that you've come across that people have really built collaboration and a sense of value and sense of community that they shared with other neighborhood associations.
Mm-hmm. That is such an important question for Portland to be asking itself right now, because what we're finding is it's almost the, you know, this powerful beast we've created of social cohesion in some of these neighborhoods where they've had high rates of engagement, and they've been doing it for so long. They know how to work the policy, they know how to pull the levers, they know how to work the system, and they have that political capital and that institutional knowledge, right? And we don't want to lose that. You know, we watched Ed Murray in Seattle try to disband the neighborhood associations, and what do you think is going to happen when you try to disband the most socially cohesive, politically knowledgeable people in your city? Bam, right? Of course you're going to get backlash. And so some of the ways that Portland has tried to look at it is we actually renamed our Office of Neighborhood Involvement, the Office of Community and Civic Life, or Civic and Community Life. I can't remember, it's very new. But it's this notion like, let's actually take the pressure off the neighborhood associations, which we know are in large part de facto homeowner associations, which if you look at Portland's history, you know, are de facto white homeowner associations. And so if we think about the homeowner associations and neighborhood associations as only one building block in the whole engagement, you know, kit, then we can start to think about what does it mean to go to social organizations? What can we do to go to faith-based organizations? Can we go to place-based organizations that may not be based on this political boundary? But also then how can we try to use those, I don't want to call that outreach, but that relationship building to then change the face of the neighborhood associations. It's a critical juncture for our city right now. We don't know which direction we are going to go. I have a personal opinion about it. Other people have opinions about how they think it should go. But I think the question is what role do you want those neighborhoods to play in the future of your place? How much power do they need to be something that's an asset to the overall livability to reach your equity and inclusion goals, to help you reach things like your climate action goals and your disaster preparedness goals? Can you use these existing organizations, that existing political capital, and point that energy toward the policy mandates that you've got on paper? Or are they going to just continue to be fighting back against every single thing you do? And if you were trying to transform that energy here, you know, a citywide summit on the future of neighborhoods isn't really a bad place to start, right? To talk to people about what are the role of these organizations in our city and how might we transform them. And I don't know if you have equity goals on your policy agenda or climate action goals, but setting those as the framework and then having the people who are already engaged in those neighborhood associations coming together to shape that future for themselves is going to be a much more effective pathway forward, in my experience, than having that mandate come from above. Some things that I'll give you one positive case study and one negative case study because I think they're both important. In my neighborhood, we were able to use the neighborhood association legitimacy to do some really guerrilla and tactical urban interventions. So we went and asked the transportation department to build us a crosswalk. When they said no, we actually kind of occupied a little unused island in the middle of an intersection and transformed that into a pocket park, and basically used our neighborhood association cred so that the bureaucracy had to work with us to make that happen. So we were able to create a park that we didn't really work with the Parks Bureau to create a park, right? So that would be a way to positively transform that energy. One more recent example is another neighborhood. I'm in like an outer ring, so about 5 kilometers from the downtown. The neighborhood association, they were having problems with homelessness, and there was a safe injection site in their neighborhood. And so they actually coalesced around maybe what I would call vigilanteism there. And the outcomes from my perspective in terms of equity were positive, because now you have a highly contentious, almost volatile situation where you've got this neighborhood watch, right, over this thing that's happening in our city where there's a lot of controversy about how we should be dealing with people and the things that are happening on our streets right now. And so, unmitigated, that social cohesion can either have great impacts when it's working to good, or potentially negative impacts when it's not working necessarily for things that have great outcomes for everybody who's in that area. Is that helpful? Not really, maybe?
Yeah.
All right. But we can talk more about it. My contact info is up there if you want to have a conversation about it. Anything else? Yeah.
Which cities do you see as having a good foundation to being able to build towards what Portland has, maybe strive towards that, like smaller cities maybe, or other places that we talk to? I think maybe they could get here in 30, 40 years.
One of my favorite cities, well, there's two, I'll call them organizations because I don't know if it's the cities, but there's two things that I see as really promising. There was a delegation I had come through several years ago. Well, I'll give you three because they're actually really cool. So several years ago, a small group of planning professionals and academics came through working on something called Smart Growth Thailand. And they started working with the coastal cities there on things like, even the resort towns like Koh Samui and a few others. And they started working on waterfront redevelopment similar to that park. But really they made it about the community process, bringing all the different stakeholders together in this conversation about retrofitting their places for sustainability and resilience against climate change. And as I've watched their organization grow and mature, I just see how by building that strong root, they've been able to accomplish a lot with their group. Another one is Tokushima, Japan, and it's actually just this one wildly innovative elder professor there who came to Portland, fell in love, and decided that he wanted to go home and build a farmer's market and do engaged learning with the university and the community and do intersection repairs and all of these things. And he has become a one-man machine in many ways for not the Portland way, but Tokushima focusing on livability. And since he's housed in the university as a professor, he's used the resources at his disposal to start building the coalition around that. So it's that notion of where you have a visionary person, but then they look around for the resources and they try to build the bridges. He's done an amazing job with that. And then the last one is the city. It's not a big city. It's called Jeonju. It's in southwestern South Korea, and it's one of the few cities in Korea that during the Japanese occupation they didn't lose most of their historic buildings. So they still have a lot of historic buildings there, and so they get a lot of tourism. Millions of tourists go there every year. But they have a pretty progressive mayor, and they have a sustainable development council, and that council is trying to create some car-free zones in the central city. And when they tried to do that, they got a lot of backlash from the business community. And as you know, when you try to do anything that seems maybe radical or progressive, a lot of times the existing business community isn't the first one to sign up and say, make that happen here. No diss on them, they have their own interests in what they're trying to do, but it's not always the first thing on their mind. So what they did, instead of doing the kind of railroading it through, is they actually visited Portland to look at community processes for transforming how they would achieve that car-free zones, as opposed to saying, hey, tell me how to do a car-free zone. They came to see, well, if you were going to have a car-free zone, because Portland doesn't even have them yet, how would you do it? And then they looked at those engagement models and those processes to transform their work. And I thought that was very insightful to look at something that we hadn't even been able to accomplish, but to come for us because we'd accomplished it for other things. And then ultimately I got to go there and work in their city with workshops like that, and now I'm going to have to bring how they're doing their car-free cities work home to Portland because we need more car-free zones there. But those are some cool places. Cam?
I guess kind of building on that, I wondered what learning has gone the other way, and what you've learned from some of the delegations, and by extension what Portland may have learned from you hosting groups from other parts of the world.
It's actually one of the most challenging parts of my job, is figuring out how to get all of the lessons that I get from these people from around the world that are in my brain and in my work out to share with my community. It hasn't been easy because civic learning is a process that we all have to share, and it's going to be hard for people to advocate to get information that they don't know exists, right? So in part it's a marketing and communications question of like, does First Stop Portland go and like shout from the rooftops, here's what we've learned and how do we get that there? One of the strategies that I've used to try and get as much information as I can is inviting people in to interact with the delegations when they're there. So we have brown bags, we have happy hours, we have as many informal gatherings with local people as possible, just so that those networks and relationships can begin to take place. So I have a delegation coming from a national bicycling advocacy group from Australia coming next September, and I'm already planning several events where I get as many people from Portland to interact with. It's only 12, 15 people who are coming, but to make sure that they're sharing the information firsthand. The other thing that I started doing is leading the outbound best practices trip that my city takes. So instead of them taking them on an ad hoc basis of, oh, we heard Copenhagen's cool, let's go there and learn something from them, is to be really intentional about how we do our city learning, because I've been an expert and we've learned how to build that expertise at Portland State University, so we can then be intentional about our city learning that we do as a community. And what does it mean to be more than just a smart city because we put a bunch of sensors on the street corners, but because we know how to learn and exchange information quickly. Because in highly dynamic times, one of the best things that I can do is not get information to my city, but make sure that my city knows how to get the information that it needs when it needs it. So building those learning networks and building that civic learning capacity is actually what I've focused on almost more than getting the information from the delegates downloaded into my community. It's hard. I don't know what to do. I'm open to suggestions, by the way, if anyone got.
As far as I know, Portland is also involved in some of the transnational city networks. I'm not sure which one it was.
We're in a lot of them now. Yeah.
Do you also cooperate with these city networks and use them for knowledge exchange?
I think that our technicians are already plugged into those networks. Like we have people in our city who, bureaucrats mostly, but also experts from the private and public, or from the private sector, nonprofit sector, who participate in those officially on behalf of the city. And I know that we're in a lot of them. C40 just being one, U.S. Conference of Mayors, we do CEOs for cities. There are at least a dozen off the top of my head that I know of, and probably more that I don't know about. But those tend to be a lot of technical transfer. And that's one of the things that I'm noting, is that I actually don't think there's any lack of capacity to do technical transfer. And even when these engagements are going on, we've hosted those conferences in Portland and those meetings. The study tours, they do mobile workshops where they walk around. I think the interesting thing about the First Stop Portland model is each one of the programs that I design is custom designed for the inbound delegation based on this research question that I try to get out of them. And once they've decided they want to come to Portland, can we build this learning experience to maximize that takeaway for you? And I think that's the difference, is that intentional learning component versus the straight tech transfer around. That seems to be more outcome driven. We want to exchange technology around a certain thing that we're trying to do. I don't know, because those tech transfer networks isn't my area of expertise. It's a model that sits slightly beside and behind the work that I'm doing. Mine's a little bit more boutique-y in a way.
Maybe time for one more question. There is. And we can let you off easy.
Oh, we can let me off easy. We got one way in the back.
It's a little bit of a repeat question. I'm just really curious to see how that transition went between like having a mayoral or municipal government turning into what you call directly appointed regional government.
Yeah, let me go back to that slide.
Yeah, like if I was a elected official or striving to become one, and you wanted to get me to that table, how would you, like, and my phone rang and it was you on the line, like, how would you start that conversation?
Projectors.
Oh, it lost me. Oh, there we go. So well, one, I would ask you, why are you asking me that question? What are you trying to solve, right? But we actually this isn't an amalgamated government. This is a whole new level of government that we created and superimposed on the existing governments without changing the governments underneath them. The only thing that really changes downstream, if you will, from that governance shift is how the local plans that they do, their comprehensive plans, have to match that regional plan. They have to be in compliance with that. And there are some other things that have to do with waste management and other activities that are happening at that regional level, where the regional government sets the policy for things that need to be regional. And so one of the attributes, if you will, that I try to explain to people is this notion of scaled problem solving. Like, why Portland needed a regional government is because there are certain things that we wanted to do at that scale for which a regional government would be the best place to do them. Integrating land use and transportation planning across municipalities transcends municipalities, it transcends counties, so you needed something bigger, but it wasn't as big as a state and nothing existed. And so for us, it was that thinking about the scaled function and the scaled problem solving that makes that happen. And so I would put back at you, if you're asking about this, we had a little bit of a conversation today about the 13 cities here that you have here. Like, maybe you don't need something like that to agglomerate them. Maybe you just need a regional coordinated body with teeth, and then the question would be, how do you get the teeth is really the thing that we're trying to look at. And some places like Allegheny Conference outside of Pittsburgh have done it through the financial levers that we've had to use, the policy levers to work on, but it may be different levers in different places to achieve the policy aims of the problem that you're trying to solve at that scale.
Right, maybe we should leave it at that. Thank you so much. Again on your birthday.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Sarah. Happy birthday to you.